The rain hadn't let up for 3 hours when security dragged her through the emergency exit and pushed her into the storm. No warning, no final paycheck, just a cardboard box of her belongings shoved into her arms and a door slamming shut behind her. Every window on the east wing of Harwick General Medical Center held a face. Nurses, orderlies, 2 attending physicians, and not one of them moved. 47 minutes later, 3 military helicopters punched through the cloud line and descended on the hospital parking structure with enough force to rattle every window in the building. A 2-star general stepped out onto the wet concrete, walked straight to the front desk, and said 4 words. "Where is she now?" If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you want to see justice actually land, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started at 6 in the morning, same as always. Mara Calloway clocked in at 5:52, 8 minutes early, because that was the kind of nurse she was. Not because anyone noticed or cared, but because the habit had been ground into her somewhere between her second deployment and her third, in conditions that made Harwick General's worst trauma nights look like a routine Tuesday. She signed out the medication cart keys, checked the handoff notes from the night nurse, and started her rounds without stopping for coffee. She'd learned to function without it years ago. Harwick General Medical Center sat on the outer edge of Dalton, Oregon, a mid-sized city that couldn't decide if it was still a logging town or something newer and more complicated. The hospital reflected that same uncertainty. The East Wing was modern, freshly funded, all glass and recessed lighting. The older North Wing smelled like floor wax and something underneath that no renovation could fully reach. The ER lived in the middle, stretched between both, and that was where Mara had been assigned for the past 4 months on a contract that paid adequately and asked nothing about her history. That was the arrangement she preferred. She was 34 years old, average height, with the kind of stillness that some people read as unfriendly and others eventually understood was simply the absence of wasted motion. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight. She didn't gossip. She didn't linger at the nurse's station trading complaints. When someone asked about her background, she said travel nursing, in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. And most people took the hint. The ones who didn't were usually the physicians. Dr. Russell Holt was the chief of emergency medicine at Harwick General, and he had decided within the first week of Mara's contract that she was a problem. Not because she made mistakes, she hadn't made a single one that could be documented, but because she moved through the ER like she already knew how everything worked, and that bothered him in a way he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. He was used to contract nurses who deferred to him instinctively, who double-checked their own competence against his approval. Mara Calloway didn't do that. She did the work, and then moved to the next thing, and the quiet efficiency of it made him feel irrationally like he was being observed. By week 2, his comments had started. Nothing actionable, just the texture of dismissal. "That's not how we do it here," said when she'd improvised a tourniquet technique that had stopped a construction worker's arterial bleed faster than the standard approach. "Try to keep up with protocol," said when she'd correctly flagged a patient's chart discrepancy that 2 residents had missed. Small things, consistent things, the kind of thing designed to sand a person down until they either quit or stop trusting themselves. Mara had heard that tone before, in other places, from other men. She absorbed it the same way she'd absorbed worse, without flinching, without giving it more than the minimum of her attention. She had other things to think about. The Tuesday morning census was manageable. A dislocated shoulder, a 7-year-old with a suspected fracture, an overnight chest pain patient waiting on labs, and an elderly woman named Dolores who had come in at 4 a.m. claiming her heart felt wrong, and whose EKG was technically within normal limits, but whose face told Mara something different. She'd flagged the chart for a follow-up troponin. The resident had given her a look that meant, "You're overcomplicating this," and hadn't ordered it yet. She flagged it again at 8:10. The resident, Dr. Pavon Ellsworth, came out of a curtained bay looking annoyed. He was 29, brand new to attendings, and wore his inexperience in the specific way of people who'd been told they were exceptional their whole lives and hadn't yet encountered a situation that meaningfully tested that story. You put a note in again, he said. I did. Her EKG is fine. Her EKG is within normal parameters, Mara said. Her pain pattern is atypical. Her pressure dropped 4 points since admission. She's diaphoretic, and she keeps saying she feels like something is wrong. And in my experience, when a 71-year-old woman says that, she usually knows. Ellsworth looked at the chart, then at Mara, then back at the chart with the expression of someone performing the act of reconsidering rather than actually doing it. I'll check on her in an hour. Okay, Mara said, because she'd learned that there was a point past which pushing got you nothing and cost you everything. She went back to Dolores's bay and sat with her for 7 minutes, explaining what was happening, what they were watching for, what Dolores should tell the nurse immediately if anything changed. Dolores reached out and squeezed her hand. You're a good one, Dolores said. I'm going to check back soon, Mara said, and she meant it in the way a promise means something. The next 2 hours moved normally. Ellsworth ordered the troponin at 9:30 after Dolores' pressure dropped another 6 points. The results came back elevated, and the patient went to the cath lab 40 minutes later where they found a widowmaker in progress. Mara heard about it from the charge nurse at the nurse's station and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve the situation. The right outcome had happened, even if it had happened late. Holt walked past at 10:15 and said, "Good catch on the Martindale patient." He said it to Ellsworth. Ellsworth, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. He glanced at Mara. Nurse Calloway flagged it twice. Holt looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been momentarily inconvenienced. Right. Good. He moved on. Mara took a breath. Let it go. Bolt. The mass casualty call came in at 11:42. Highway accident on Route 9 northbound. A tractor trailer had jackknifed across 3 lanes during a rain squall and taken out 4 vehicles, including a passenger bus. 12 confirmed injured, 3 critical. ETA on first arrivals, 6 minutes. The ER went into its version of controlled chaos, which was less controlled than anyone wanted to admit. Holt barked assignments. Nurses pulled crash carts. Ellsworth went visibly pale and then reorganized himself with visible effort. Mara scrubbed in, took her assigned bay, and waited. The first wave arrived fast. Lacerations, fractures, 2 patients with significant head trauma. Standard triage rhythm. Mara worked through her patients methodically, assessing, stabilizing, charting, communicating, moving at the pace the situation required without burning energy she didn't have. The third critical patient came in at 12:04, and the paramedics were moving fast. He was male, mid-50s, large through the chest and shoulders, in full civilian clothes that had been cut open at the scene. Blunt chest trauma. Suspected internal bleeding. But what the lead paramedic told Holt as they transferred was the detail that changed the energy in the room. Airways compromised. Progressive swelling, we couldn't intubate in the field. We've got maybe 3 minutes of viable window left. Holt moved immediately and hit the first problem fast. The patient's anatomy was working against the standard approach. Massive neck trauma, swelling already distorting the landmarks, jaw clenched from pain and muscle spasm. He made one attempt with the laryngoscope and couldn't visualize the chords. "Get me a videoscope," he said. They brought it. He tried again, failed again. The monitor showed oxygen saturation dropping. 91, 89, 87. "He's desatting," someone said, unnecessarily. Mara was positioned at the patient's right side, and she could see what Holt couldn't see from his angle. The specific configuration of the swelling, the way the tissue had displaced, the small but real window that still existed if you approached it differently. She'd seen necks like this before. She'd worked on necks like this in places where there was no videoscope, no anesthesiologist on standby, no margin for a third attempt. "Dr. Holt," she said. Not loudly, clearly. "Not now. The displacement is lateral. If you come from a more anterior angle with a smaller blade, I said not now." He was already repositioning. Third attempt, same approach. The saturation hit 84. Mara made a decision. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask. She moved around the head of the bed with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a practice sequence reached for the smaller curved blade on the tray, and said, "I'm going to need you to step back for 30 seconds." The room went completely still. Holt looked up from the patient, and the expression on his face went through 3 stages so fast they nearly overlapped: confusion, outrage, and the specific fury of a man who understood he was being superseded by someone he'd already decided didn't matter. "What did you just—" "His SAT is at 81, the tech said. Mara had already positioned herself. What she did next wasn't textbook. It wasn't something learned in a nursing program or even in a standard paramedic curriculum. It was a technique developed for forward operating environments where the choices were do this or watch someone die, refined across more applications than she could count, muscle memory at this point rather than thought. She used her left hand to stabilize the structures, guided the blade with her right, found the angle she'd seen from across the table, and placed the tube in one smooth motion. The bag mask connected. The ventilator registered resistance, then compliance. The saturation began climbing. 82, 85, 89. Nobody in the room moved for a full 3 seconds. "Bilateral breath sounds," Mara said, and stepped back. The monitor hit 94, then 96. Ellsworth said very quietly, "Holy, get him to CT," Holt said. His voice was completely flat. Mara began stripping her gloves. Her hands were steady. She could feel the adrenaline, but she was accustomed to that, accustomed to the way the body lit up and the mind stayed separate from it, clinical and precise, right up until the moment when it was over and you let yourself come back down. She didn't look at Holt. She didn't need to. The patient moved out of the bay toward CT, and the room began its slow exhale. People shifting back to their other tasks, voices returning to normal register. Mara updated the chart, logged the procedure, documented the clinical rationale with the specificity she'd been trained to maintain even under pressure. Every step, every observation, every decision, written clearly, time-stamped, signed. She had been taught to create a record that would survive scrutiny. She was still writing when Holt appeared at the edge of the bay. "Step outside," he said. She finished the sentence she was typing. "Now, but..." She saved the entry, stood, and followed him into the hallway that connected the ER to the hospital's main corridor. It was quieter here. The mass casualty noise was still audible, but muffled, the bright overhead lights giving everything a slightly greenish cast. Holt waited until they were past the main flow of foot traffic before he turned around. "You took over an active resuscitation," he said, "without authorization, without consent. You pushed me aside in front of my staff. The patient's saturation was at 81%. You had made 3 attempts with the same approach each. That is not your call to make. The outcome. I don't care about the outcome right now." He said it with a certainty that would have been shocking in a different context. "You are a contract nurse. You are not an attending. You are not a physician. You have no standing to override a physician's clinical decision. And what you did in that room, whatever you thought you were doing, is a termination offense." Mara looked at him. She chose her words the way she chose everything, carefully, without ornamentation. "He's alive because of what happened in that room," she said. "If that matters to you at all, it should be somewhere in this conversation." Holt's jaw tightened. "Security will escort you out. You'll receive your final pay by direct deposit. Do not expect a reference." He walked back toward the ER without waiting for a response. Mara stood in the hallway for a moment. The linoleum was clean and impersonal beneath her feet. The fluorescent hum above her was constant, neutral. She thought about arguing, not because it would have helped, but because some part of her wanted to make him stay in the conversation long enough to actually hear what she'd said. But she'd been in enough situations to know when a decision had already been made, and Russell Holt had made his before he'd followed her into the hallway. She went back to the nurse's station, picked up the cardboard box someone had already helpfully produced, and began clearing out her small collection of personal items. A tube of lip balm, a granola bar from the bottom drawer, her personal stethoscope. Nobody said anything to her directly. A few people watched. The charge nurse, a woman named Beatrice, who had been at Harwick for 11 years and had seen enough to recognize injustice without being willing to publicly oppose it, caught Mara's eye as she passed and gave her a look that communicated something. Regret, maybe, or the particular guilt of a bystander who knows they should have moved and didn't. Mara acknowledged it with a brief nod. No performance, no scene. She carried the box to the emergency exit, and a security officer named Garrett walked her through it without meeting her eyes. The rain hit her immediately. It had been building all morning, a Pacific system pushing inland, heavy and cold, and now it came down in sheets that soaked through her scrub top in under 10 seconds. Mara stood on the concrete apron outside the exit for a moment, box under her arm, and looked at the parking structure across the way. Her car was on the 3rd level. She started walking. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see the shapes of people moving in the ER's light. A machine that kept moving regardless, indifferent to what had just happened. She reached the bus stop on the side street at 12:41 because her car wouldn't start, a battery issue she'd been meaning to address. And she stood under the shelter with her cardboard box and her soaked scrubs and waited. The shelter had a cracked plastic roof that channeled the rain into a thin stream directly onto the concrete 3 feet from where she was standing. She shifted left to avoid it. She didn't call anyone. There wasn't anyone to call, not in the way people meant when they said that. Not because she had no one, but because the people who knew her well enough to understand what had just happened were scattered across contexts that didn't overlap with this life she was currently living. And because calling felt like the beginning of a process she wasn't ready to start. An explanation that would require unpacking things she'd spent a meaningful amount of effort keeping packed. So she stood and waited and listened to the rain. She was still standing there at 1:28 when she heard them. Not saw, heard first, because the sound was distinctive and cut through the rain and the ambient traffic noise in a way that didn't fit the context. A deep, rhythmic percussion she hadn't heard outside a specific operational environment in several years. She turned and looked north, past the hospital structure, at the low gray cloud ceiling. 3 shapes resolved out of the overcast. Blackhawks. Military configuration, unmarked at this distance, but unmistakable in silhouette and sound. The rotor signature of that platform was something her body recognized before her mind caught up. They were descending, not passing over. Descending, steep and deliberate, toward Harwick General's helipad and the parking structure roof. Mara set the cardboard box down on the wet bench. She watched them come in. The landing was professional, sequenced, coordinated, covering multiple positions rather than stacking on a single pad. Not medical transport. The spacing and positioning were tactical. Whoever was aboard wasn't coming for a routine evacuation. The rotors hadn't fully spooled down when the doors opened and figures moved out fast and purposeful into the rain. And even from this distance, Mara could read the posture and the pace of people who operated with a specific kind of authority. The kind that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. Her fingers had gone cold around the edge of the cardboard box. She thought about the patient. Mid-50s, large build. The clothes had been civilian, but the watch on his left wrist had been military issue. The specific model she recognized from a context she'd spent a long time trying to not think about. She hadn't let herself look too closely at his face during the procedure. You learned not to, in situations where focus on the task was the only thing keeping the outcome from going wrong. But she'd registered enough. She thought about the watch. She thought about 3 Blackhawks deploying with tactical spacing to a civilian hospital in Dalton, Oregon on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain came down harder. Inside Harwick General, through the glass walls of the main lobby 300 feet away, she could see movement, a cluster of figures at the reception desk, uniforms distinguishable even at distance. She watched one of them turn to the receptionist. She couldn't hear anything. She didn't need to, because she already knew, somewhere below conscious thought, in the part of her that had been trained to process information faster than language could keep up with, exactly what question was being asked inside that building. And she knew her name was the answer. She didn't move toward the building. That was the first thing. The instinct she had to consciously override, because every other version of herself from a different life would have already been moving, assessing angles, calculating distance to the entrance, running contingencies. That version of her had been put away carefully, locked down in a place she'd worked hard to maintain. She stayed at the bus stop with her cardboard box and her wet scrubs and watched the lobby through the rain. The cluster of uniforms at the reception desk wasn't dispersing. If anything, it had grown. She could see two people in scrubs now, hospital staff, talking with what appeared to be a degree of nervous animation that was legible even at 300 feet. The man at the center of the group, the one the others were orienting toward, stood differently from the rest. Shoulders back, weight centered, completely still, while everyone around him moved. She recognized that stillness. She'd seen it in people who'd spent enough time in command positions that the body eventually stopped performing authority and simply became it. Mara picked up her box. She had 3 options. The bus would come in 11 minutes. She could get on it, go back to her rental, and start the process of figuring out what came next. A new contract, a new city, the same arrangement with different furniture. Option 2 was to walk away from the bus stop in the other direction and take the long way around, avoid the whole situation, give herself time to think before any of it reached her. Option 3 was to stand here until it came to her, because it already felt like the kind of situation where options 1 and 2 were more procedural than real. She was still sorting through this when she saw one of the figures in the lobby turn and point through the glass toward the street in a direction that aligned closely enough with her position that her stomach dropped before her brain had finished processing why. 30 seconds later, 2 men in AC-US were coming across the parking structure apron toward her in the rain. They weren't running. They were walking with the pace of people who'd been told to move quickly but not cause a scene, and they weren't carrying anything in their hands, and they stopped 4 feet away from her in a way that was professional and deliberately non-threatening. The taller one spoke first. "Ma'am, are you Mara Calloway?" "Depends on who's asking," she said, which was habit more than evasion. "Sergeant First Class Doyle with General Hargrove's security element. The general is requesting your presence inside." She looked at them. Both early 30s, fit, eyes clear and alert. Neither of them was performing anything. They were just waiting for her answer, prepared for whatever it was. "Hargrove," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't ask which Hargrove, because there was only one she knew of at that rank in the Army's current structure, and the name arriving here, today, attached to 3 Blackhawks and a security element, reorganized several things she'd been holding separately in her head into a configuration that made a specific kind of terrible sense. "Tell the general I'll be there in a minute," she said. Doyle didn't argue. "We'll walk with you." She looked down at the cardboard box, looked at the bus stop, set the box on the bench with a deliberateness that was as close to a statement as she was willing to make, and walked back toward Harwick General Medical Center between 2 soldiers in the rain. The lobby went quiet when she came through the door. Not completely. The hospital noise continued in the background, the PA system, the distant movement of the building's ordinary life. But the particular section of lobby where General Kathleen Hargrove stood, with 4 members of her staff, went still in a way that was unmistakably about Mara's arrival. Hargrove was 61 and looked 55, and carried herself in the way of a woman who'd been told throughout her career that she was taking up space that belonged to someone else, and had decided at some point to occupy it completely instead. 2 stars on her collar, short silver hair, an expression that was currently doing something complicated, something that Mara's brain cataloged as the intersection of relief and controlled anger and something older and harder to name. They looked at each other across 12 feet of hospital lobby. "Calloway," Hargrove said. "General, I need you to come with me." "I was just escorted out of this building," Mara said. "You might want to coordinate with whoever's running security about that." Something moved across Hargrove's face. Not quite amusement, the recognition of someone who remembered exactly who she was dealing with. "I'll handle it. Come with me." She turned and walked, and after a beat, Mara followed. The group moved through the main corridor toward the ER wing, and Mara could see heads turning as they passed. Hospital staff stopping mid-conversation, watching the procession with the particular attention people give to things that don't fit the established pattern of a place. A general officer didn't walk the halls of Harwick General. The last time military presence had come through here in any meaningful way was probably a recruitment fair in the cafeteria. Holt was standing at the entrance to the ER. He'd clearly been told something. He had the look of a man who'd received information that hadn't arranged itself into a coherent picture yet, and he was standing very straight in the way people do when they're trying to project authority in a situation where they're not sure they have any. He looked at Hargrove. He looked at Mara. He looked back at Hargrove. "Dr. Holt," Hargrove said, not slowing down, "I need access to your trauma bay and your patient's current location." "That patient is in CT," Holt said. "And I have to ask, what is the Army's interest in a highway accident victim? This is a civilian facility, and I'm the chief of—" "He's not a highway accident victim." Hargrove stopped, turned, gave Holt her full attention in the way that functioned, Mara knew, as a form of pressure. "And the nature of the Army's interest is classified, which means this conversation is over. Where is CT?" Holt's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Mara with an expression that had started as contempt and was now doing something more complicated, recalibrating against new information that he didn't fully have yet. "Second floor," he said. "North elevator bank." Hargrove moved. The patient was in CT Bay 2, post-scan, being monitored by a radiology tech and one of the ER residents who looked up when the group entered with an expression of complete bewilderment. The man on the table was still sedated. The tube Mara had placed was still in, maintained now on a portable ventilator, and the monitors showed a picture that was precarious but holding. Hargrove stood at the bedside and looked at him for a moment with an expression Mara didn't try to interpret. Then she turned to the resident. "Give us the room." "I'm responsible for—" "Someone will be in with you in 3 minutes. Give us the room." The resident left, clearly unhappy and clearly unwilling to make it a confrontation. Hargrove looked at Mara. "Tell me exactly what you did." Mara walked her through it, clinical, sequential, without editorializing. The airway presentation, the 3 failed attempts, the saturation drop, the specific technique she'd used, and why, what she'd seen from her angle that the attending physician hadn't been able to see from his. Hargrove listened without interrupting. One of her staff, a younger woman with a major's insignia and a tablet, was taking notes. When Mara finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "You placed that tube clean?" she said. "First attempt." "What blade?" Size 3 Macintosh, anterior approach, came in about 15 degrees off midline because the swelling had displaced the landmarks rightward. Standard approach wasn't going to find the cords. Hargrove looked at the patient. "And nobody else in that ER could have done what you did." It wasn't entirely a question, but Mara answered it like one. "I don't know that. I know I was the one who did it, and that it worked." "Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you, and we don't have time for it." Mara said nothing. "His name is Lieutenant General Warren Pace," Hargrove said quietly, "Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. The convoy accident wasn't an accident. We've had confirmation in the last 40 minutes that the vehicle was targeted. Someone on that highway knew his route and his schedule, and they planned accordingly." She paused. "He would have died in that trauma bay if you hadn't been there." The room hummed with the sound of monitors and ventilator and the particular quality of silence that follows information of that magnitude. "He's going to need surgery," Mara said, because that was the most useful thing she could contribute. "The CT findings?" The major with the tablet turned the screen. Mara looked at the images. Splenic laceration, grade 3. Contained for now, but the trajectory wasn't stable and waiting wasn't a real option. "Your surgical team here," Hargrove said. "Adequate for the procedure," Mara said. "There's a trauma surgeon on staff, Dr. Adisa Ferreira. I've watched her work. She's solid." "Not Holt. Definitely not Holt." Hargrove turned to her staff. "Get Dr. Ferreira in here. Background check. 20 minutes, not 30. And I want this room locked down to essential personnel only." She turned back to Mara. "You're staying." "I was terminated this morning." "You were reinstated 4 minutes ago. I called the hospital administrator from the parking structure." A beat. "He was very cooperative." Mara learned the fuller shape of it in pieces over the next 90 minutes, in the spaces between clinical demands. Warren Pace had been in Dalton for reasons that weren't on any public schedule. A meeting with a defense contractor whose facility sat 15 miles east of the city, something involving a procurement process that had been running for 2 years and was currently the subject of a quiet internal review. The convoy had been 2 vehicles. 3 support personnel had been injured in the crash. One was in a hospital 60 miles south with a broken pelvis. The convoy's route, which had been communicated through a secure channel that was now being treated as potentially compromised, had apparently been known by someone who'd used that knowledge to position a commercial vehicle in exactly the right place on Route 9. The investigation was 4 hours old and already pulling in multiple agencies. Mara absorbed all of this while doing her actual job, monitoring Pace's vitals, coordinating with Dr. Ferreira's prep team, making sure the sedation was calibrated correctly, given his other injuries. She had been handed back her badge and access by a flustered administrator who couldn't meet her eyes, and she'd taken both without comment and gone back to work. Holt had not reappeared. She heard from Beatrice, who materialized at her elbow at some point in the early afternoon with a protein bar and an expression of barely contained emotion, that he had been pulled into a meeting with hospital administration and Hargrove's legal officer and had not come back out yet. Beatrice wanted to say something. Mara could see it building, and she appreciated the restraint it took for her not to. "Thank you," Mara said about the protein bar. "That's all I've got right now," Beatrice said, which was honest and sufficient. Ferreira's surgery began at 3:15 p.m., and Mara spent the intervening time with Hargrove's staff, answering questions about the specific sequence of events in the trauma bay, reviewing what she'd documented in the chart, confirming the timeline. The major with the tablet, whose name was Solace, was precise and efficient and wrote everything down twice. She didn't ask anything outside her mandate, and when she was finished, she said, "Thank you, Calloway," in a tone that suggested she knew more context than she was currently sharing. At 4:02, while Mara was in the small break room off the ER eating half the protein bar, Hargrove came in and closed the door. This was, Mara recognized, the real conversation. Hargrove sat down across from her. No staff, no tablet. The professional armor was still in place, but there was something underneath it now. Something more personal and less easy to categorize. "How long have you been here?" Hargrove asked. "In Dalton. 4 months. Before that? Medford. Before that, Spokane." Mara looked at her. "You know the answer to that. You've seen the file." "I've seen the parts of the file that exist," Hargrove said. "Some of it's still sealed." She paused. "By request." "By mine," Mara said. "Yes." "You want to tell me why you walked away?" Mara thought about how to answer this. She'd had versions of this answer. She'd prepared different ones for different audiences, but none of them had ever been asked by someone who actually had the context to understand it. "I made a report," she said, "through proper channels, about procurement irregularities I observed during my 3rd deployment. The report went to my commanding officer, and from there it went somewhere. 3 months later, I was offered a medical discharge and a settlement and a very clear suggestion that continuing to serve would become difficult for me in ways that would be hard to document but easy to feel." "You took the discharge." "I took the discharge." She said it without apology because there wasn't any. "I had information and no effective channel for it, and staying in felt like endorsing a situation I'd already rejected. The report was buried." "Apparently." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light in the break room was different from the one in the main ER. Slightly warmer, which somehow made the conversation feel more exposed. "What you uncovered in that report," Hargrove said, "is adjacent to what Pace was looking at. Not the same investigation, but adjacent. Close enough that when I saw your name on the chart from this morning, I needed to verify before I said anything." She looked at Mara steadily. "It changes the picture of what happened today." Mara set down the protein bar. "You think I was here because of Pace?" "I think someone might want me to think that." "I've been at Harwick for 4 months. I took the contract because they had a vacancy and the pay was decent." "I know." Hargrove's voice shifted. Not softer, exactly, but with less of the formal distance. "I checked. I'm telling you because the people running this investigation are going to ask you the same thing in a less conversational way, and I want you to have had a chance to hear it first." Mara processed that. The warning implicit in it, that she was now inside a situation that would be examined from multiple directions by people who were professionally suspicious of coincidence. "Okay," she said. "And because what you did this morning saved Warren Pace's life, And whoever targeted that convoy didn't get the outcome they wanted, and that matters. It should be said plainly. Mara nodded once. It didn't require more than that. What I need to know, Hargrove continued, leaning slightly forward, is whether there's anything else. Anything from your time in service, anything you observed, anything in that report that never went anywhere, that might be relevant to what's happening now. Because if there is, this is the moment to put it on the table. The break room was very quiet. Mara thought about what she'd written in that report 7 years ago, the specific irregularities, the names she'd attached to them, carefully, with as much documentation as she could assemble in the window she'd had. She thought about the settlement agreement she'd signed, the language of it, the way it had been constructed to be permanent and comprehensive. She thought about the watch on Warren Pace's wrist. There's one name, she said, in the original report. Someone I identified as a coordinating party, not a primary actor, but facilitating. Someone with access to scheduling information. Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. Give me the name. Mara gave it to her. Hargrove wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. Mara could see that the name had landed somewhere already populated with related information, connecting to something Hargrove already had. All right, Hargrove said, after a moment. Stay available. Don't go anywhere tonight. She stood. And Calloway, the thing this morning, the technique. A pause. I've been in this business a long time. That airway approach is taught in exactly one training environment I know of, and it's not a nursing program. Mara met her eyes. Where did you learn it? Hargrove asked. It was quiet in the break room. Through the wall, the distant sounds of the hospital continued. The PA, the footsteps, the machinery of a building that processed human emergencies around the clock and kept moving regardless. Forward Surgical Team, 75th Ranger Regiment, Mara said. Kandahar Province, 2017. A surgeon named Dr. Marcus Webb taught it to every medic in the unit after we lost a patient on the table because the standard approach failed. Hargrove absorbed that. Marcus Webb, she said, and her voice had changed register in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. You know him, Mara said. Knew him. A beat. He died 8 months ago, vehicle accident on a mountain road outside of Reno. She watched Mara's face. The investigation was closed as accidental. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily from the next room over. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. The ventilator pushed air into Warren Pace's lungs at a rate Mara had calculated 45 minutes ago and hadn't changed since. She held Hargrove's gaze and said nothing, because what she was thinking was not something to say out loud. Not yet. Not before she'd had time to run it against what she knew and what she suspected, and the distance between those two things. But the distance was closing fast, and that was the thing that didn't leave her alone for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus Webb. Dead 8 months ago on a mountain road outside Reno. The investigation closed as accidental. Mara had known Webb as a surgeon who worked under conditions that would have broken most people. Forward deployed, under-resourced, making decisions in real time with incomplete information and no margin for error. He wasn't the kind of man who died on mountain roads. He was the kind of man who survived them, because he paid attention to things most people didn't think to pay attention to, and because he'd been trained in environments where inattention had a body count. She didn't say any of that to Hargrove. What she said was, "When did you find out it was Webb's technique on the chart?" "When I read the procedure note you filed," Hargrove said. "The specific terminology, the approach notation." She paused. "I've seen that written down before, in a debrief from 2018 that I wasn't supposed to have access to but did. And that's when you came here personally." "That's when I came here personally." A beat. "Among other reasons." Hargrove left the break room. Mara sat with the remaining half of the protein bar and the particular quality of quiet that follows a conversation that has just made the world measurably more dangerous than it was before it started. She was not frightened. Fear was something she recognized as useful data rather than an experience to be avoided. And right now the data it was giving her was that she was standing at the edge of something large and mostly submerged, with no clear picture of how far down it went. She finished the protein bar, stood up, went back to work. Ferreira's surgery ran 4 hours and 11 minutes. Mara wasn't in the OR. She didn't have surgical privileges at Harwick, and nobody had suggested she should be present. But she stayed close, monitoring the relayed updates through the charge nurse and checking in with the anesthesiology team at the 90-minute mark, because the sedation she'd established in the trauma bay needed to be accounted for in the surgical protocol, and she wanted to make sure that communication had been clean. It had. Ferreira was thorough. At 7:28 p.m., the surgery ended, and Pace was moved to the surgical ICU. Mara was allowed in for 5 minutes at 8:15 in the company of Solis and one of Hargrove's other staff members to assess the airway, specifically the tube she'd placed, which had remained in through the entire surgical procedure and was now being evaluated for removal. The ICU attending, a quiet man named Dr. Okafor, who had clearly been briefed to some degree about the unusual nature of this patient's admission, walked her through the post-op films with the slightly guarded manner of a professional sharing information with another professional whose credentials he couldn't quite place. She answered his clinical questions directly and accurately. He relaxed incrementally. By the end of the 5 minutes, they were talking as colleagues. "Extubation tomorrow morning if he's stable overnight," Okafor said. "He should be," Mara said. "The placement was clean, and he's been tolerating it well. Watch the pressure in the cuff. His throat swelling may shift as the anti-inflammatories work." "I will." He looked at her. "You place this under," the notes say, suboptimal visualization, active desaturation, first attempt. "Yes." "Where did you train?" "Military," she said, which was the answer she'd found covered the most ground without creating new questions she didn't want to answer. He nodded slowly, as if that explained something that had been bothering him. She left the ICU and found Solis waiting in the corridor. "General Hargrove wants a meeting at 9, Solis said. "Conference room on the administrative floor. There will be other people present." "What kind of other people?" Solis looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral, in a way that conveyed information through its very completeness. "The investigative kind." There were 4 of them in the conference room when Mara arrived, plus Hargrove and Solis. 2 were Army, a colonel named Reyes with the specific clipped affect of someone from the CID, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, and a younger officer who was introduced by rank but not by name. The other 2 were federal, one from the FBI, and one who identified herself only as being from a coordinating office, in a way that meant she wasn't going to say more than that. The woman from the coordinating office was named Taft. She was roughly Mara's age, wore civilian clothes that fit slightly too well, and had the habit of listening to everything without writing anything down. Mara clocked her as the most dangerous person in the room, not in a physical sense, but in the sense that she was collecting and evaluating and had not yet decided what she was going to do with what she found. The meeting started with Reyes running through the confirmed facts of the convoy incident, sanitized, careful, the version assembled for sharing across agencies. Mara listened and identified 3 things she already knew, 2 things she hadn't known, and 1 significant gap that she suspected was deliberate. When Reyes finished, Taft spoke. "Ms. Calloway," she said, "you filed an internal military report in 2016 identifying irregularities in a procurement process during your 3rd deployment. That report was received by your commanding officer and subsequently not forwarded through the standard review chain." "That's accurate, Mara said. "You left the service 14 months after filing it." "Yes." "Did you maintain any records of the original report?" "I made copies before I submitted it," Mara said. "I kept them." The temperature in the room shifted. Not dramatically, nobody moved or spoke, but something changed in the quality of attention, the way it all oriented toward her. "Where are those copies now?" Taft asked. "Secure storage," Mara said. "Not local." Taft studied her. "We'd like access to those documents." "I'd like to speak with an attorney before I agree to that." "You're not under investigation." "I know I'm not. I'd still like to speak with an attorney." Hargrove, who was sitting to Mara's left, said nothing, but Mara could feel the slight shift in her posture. something that might have been approval. Reyes interjected, "Ms. Calloway, we're trying to establish whether there's a connection between the 2016 report you filed and the individuals currently under investigation in relation to General Pace's convoy." "The name I gave General Hargrove this afternoon," Mara said. "Have you run it against your current list?" Reyes and Taft exchanged a look. "Yes," Reyes said. "Then you know the answer to whether there's a connection." Another pause, the kind that meant yes, and we're figuring out how to move forward with that. Taft leaned back. "The name you provided corresponds to a current civilian contractor with access to DoD scheduling systems. That individual was placed on administrative leave 4 hours ago pending investigation." She said it as if confirming facts, not delivering new information. "His access logs show a query on General Pace's travel itinerary 48 hours before the convoy incident." Mara absorbed this without expression. The satisfaction she might have expected to feel wasn't quite present. In its place was something colder and more purposeful. The recognition that she'd been right 7 years ago, that the report she'd filed and lost and been pushed out for had documented a real thread, and that thread had been long enough and strong enough to reach all the way to a highway outside Dalton, Oregon. "I want to understand something," the FBI agent, whose name was Garland, said. He'd been quiet through most of the meeting, making notes. "You left the service, took travel nursing contracts, and ended up at this particular hospital 4 months ago. Walk me through how that placement happened." "Agency placement," Mara said. "Nationwide medical staffing. They sent me a vacancy list. I picked the contract that paid best for the location. I submitted my application, and I was hired." She looked at him steadily. "I can give you the recruiter's name and the email chain." "We'll want those." I figured. She wasn't offended. If she were running this investigation, she would want them too. "I didn't know Warren Pace was going to be in Dalton. I didn't know there was a convoy on Route 9. I was assigned to a Tuesday ER shift and a highway accident came through my department." She let that sit for a moment. "The coincidence is uncomfortable. I understand that. But it is what it is." Garland looked at his notes. "You knew Dr. Marcus Webb." "I did." "Webb died in October. General Hargrove informed me of that earlier today." "Were you aware of it before today?" "No." She kept her voice level. "I've been careful about maintaining distance from my previous life. I don't follow military news. I don't maintain contact with former colleagues." She paused. Webb was the closest thing to an exception. He was a good doctor and a decent person, but I hadn't spoken to him in over 3 years. Garland wrote something. "His accident. We've reopened it." Mara didn't respond because responding to that would mean saying something about what she thought had happened to Marcus Webb, and that was not a theory she was going to voice in this room, to these people, without an attorney and considerably more certainty than she currently had. "I think we have enough for tonight," Hargrove said. It wasn't entirely a suggestion. She was given a room in the hospital's on-call suite, a small space with a bed and a private bathroom that smelled like industrial soap, ordinarily used by residents pulling overnight shifts. Solis brought her a bag from her car, which someone had driven to the hospital from the parking structure. She didn't ask how they'd gotten her keys. She sat on the edge of the bed at 11:30 p.m. and didn't sleep. The name she'd given Hargrove, the name that had connected to the contractor's access logs, was a man she'd identified in 2016 as a mid-level facilitator, someone with a foot in both the military logistics structure and a constellation of private contractors with overlapping interests. She hadn't known his full significance then. She'd flagged him as a node in a pattern she could see without being able to see its full dimensions. Now she was beginning to see the full dimensions. Webb had seen them too, she thought, and Webb was dead. She lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the acoustic tile ceiling and went through the logic of it systematically, the way she'd been trained. Start with what you know, work outward to what you can reasonably infer, maintain discipline about the boundary between those two categories. The procurement irregularities she'd documented in 2016 were the earliest point she could trace. The pattern they described, inflated contracts, specific vendors, decision-makers who moved through a revolving door between military acquisition and private sector, was not unique to her deployment, which meant it had been running longer and wider than what she'd seen. Webb had been on a surgical deployment with her. He had seen the same environment. He had been the one to write up a separate incident report. She'd known about it at the time, had discussed it with him. That had also, as far as she could tell, gone nowhere. 8 months ago, on a mountain road. She turned that over for a long time. At 1:15 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered, because at this point the set of people with reason to contact her at 1:15 a.m. had expanded considerably. "This is Reyes," the voice said. "CID. We spoke earlier." "I remember." "I need to tell you something off the record before morning." A pause, and she could hear him moving. Footsteps, then a door. "The administrative leave on the contractor. He was notified by his employer before we could implement communications restriction." Mara sat up. "He's in the wind." "Not confirmed, but he's not at his residence and his phone has gone dark." Reyes's voice was controlled, but carrying something underneath it that wasn't control. "I'm telling you because you gave us the name and because you need to be careful tonight. There's a possibility, small but real, that whoever is monitoring this situation has visibility on today's events, including your involvement." The on-call room suddenly felt very small. "What kind of visibility?" she said. "We don't know yet." That's the honest answer. Another pause. "There's a security element outside your room. They've been there since 9. I just want you to know that and to know why." After he hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand and listened. The hospital breathed around her. The low, systemic sound of a building that never fully went quiet, ventilation and generators, and the distant footsteps of the night shift. She thought about the security element in the corridor and found it more reassuring than she'd expected, which told her something about how seriously she was taking this. She'd been careful for 7 years, kept her head down, kept moving, taken contracts in mid-sized cities and done her job and maintained a distance from anything that might pull her back into the gravity of what she'd walked away from. And then a highway accident had come through her ER at 12:04 on a Tuesday. She was still sitting with that thought at 2:30 a.m. when the alarm sounded. It wasn't the hospital's general alarm. It was a localized alert, the specific tone of the ICU's monitoring system, broadcasting through the PA in the short, urgent pattern that meant a patient in that unit was in sudden deterioration. She was moving before she was fully aware of having decided to, pulling on her shoes, reaching for the badge they'd returned to her, out the door and past the security element. 2 soldiers who half moved to intercept her and then registered her badge in her direction and fell into step behind her instead. The ICU was 50 meters down the corridor and a floor up. She took the stairs. The nursing station was in motion when she arrived. 2 nurses moving fast toward Bay 4, which was Warren Pace's room. Dr. Okafor was already there, having apparently been closer or faster. Mara pushed through and assessed in the first 3 seconds. The ventilator alarm was showing high resistance, the saturation had dropped to 88, and Pace's blood pressure had spiked in the specific pattern that meant something was obstructing. "Tube migration," she said, not loudly but clearly. Okafor looked up, looked at the ventilator readout, looked back at the patient's chest. "Left side is diminished," one of the nurses confirmed. The tube had shifted. Not much, not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough to preferentially ventilate one lung and leave the other starved. It happened with tubed patients who moved during sleep, and it happened faster when the tube had been placed under urgent conditions rather than controlled ones, and the post-op measurements had been set against a slightly different anatomy than the pre-sedation baseline. Mara knew exactly where it had shifted and exactly what needed to happen. "I need a 10 cc syringe, deflate the cuff, let me reposition." "You're not authorized," the second nurse started. "I placed this tube, I know where it needs to be." She looked at Okafor, directly. "His SAT is at 85 and dropping. Tell me what you want to do." Okafor made the decision in 2 seconds. "Let her work." What happened next took 4 minutes and involved no drama. Just the methodical, precise business of deflating the cuff, withdrawing the tube 2 centimeters, re-inflating, reconnecting, and verifying bilateral breath sounds with a stethoscope while the ventilator readout climbed back through 90 and 93 and settled at 96. Mara held the tube steady while Okafor confirmed the position on both sides. Her hands did not shake. When it was done, the room exhaled. "Good catch," Okafor said quietly. The two nurses looked at each other with the expressions of people revising a prior assessment. Mara stepped back and let Okafor take the follow-up. The retaping, the documentation, the conversation with the overnight intensivist who'd appeared at the bay door, and went to stand at the corridor window while the room reorganized itself. The city outside was dark and wet, the lights of Dalton smeared by rain on the glass. She could see the reflection of the ICU behind her in the window, the controlled movement, the monitors, the bay where Warren Pace's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was maintained by a tube she'd now intervened on twice. She was still at the window when Solis materialized at her elbow. "You need to come with me," Solis said. The professional neutrality was still present, but something had cut through the surface of it. "What happened?" "General Hargrove needs to brief you personally." Solis's voice was steady and precise and carefully uninflected in the way that people are uninflected when the information they're carrying is significant enough that they don't trust their own tone. "We've had a development in the last 40 minutes. "The contractor," Mara said. "Not the contractor." Solis glanced down the corridor. The security element was still there, but a third person had joined them. Someone Mara hadn't seen before, civilian clothes, the careful posture of someone who'd been moving fast until recently and had just stopped. "We've been going through the hospital's administrative records as part of the investigation perimeter. Financial records, billing systems, access logs." Mara turned from the window. "We found something," Solis said, "and it doesn't have anything to do with General Pace's convoy." The rain continued against the glass. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered immediately. The overnight hum of Harwick General surrounded them, familiar and continuous, the background noise Mara had moved through for 4 months without thinking about what it might be covering. "What did you find?" she said. Solis looked at her for one moment, the specific look of someone about to hand another person a weight they hadn't anticipated carrying, and said, "Dr. Holt's billing records go back 6 years, and they don't match the surgical logs." Mara looked at Solis for a moment. Not long, just enough to make sure she'd heard it correctly, and that Solis's face confirmed what the words suggested. And then she said, "Show me." The administrative offices on the 3rd floor were not supposed to be accessible at 2:47 in the morning. The access log would later show that Solis had used a temporary override credential issued by the hospital's board chair at Hargrove's request at approximately 11 p.m., which meant Hargrove had anticipated needing it before anyone had found anything specific to need it for. Mara filed that detail without comment and followed Solis through the corridor and into the office suite that housed the hospital's financial systems team. 2 people were already in there. One was Garland from the FBI, jacket off, sitting in front of a workstation with the focused look of someone reading something that was giving him a headache in the best possible way. The other was a woman Mara hadn't seen before. Late 40s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd been doing forensic accounting long enough that fraud patterns registered to her the way bad grammar registers to an editor. Her name, Mara would learn in the next 4 minutes, was Diane Yu, and she'd been flown in from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Portland and had been working in this office for the past 3 hours. Hargrove was standing behind Garland, looking at the screen. She turned when Mara came in. "Close the door," she said. Solis did it. "Tell her what you told me," Hargrove said to Yu. Yu took off her reading glasses and let them hang. She had the manner of someone who'd delivered this kind of briefing many times and had stopped apologizing for the density of it. The billing records for the emergency department and general surgery at this hospital show a consistent pattern going back to approximately 2018. Procedures coded at a higher complexity level than what's documented in the corresponding surgical logs. Insurance reimbursements claimed for services that either didn't happen or happened at a fraction of the documented cost. She paused. It's not sophisticated. It's systematic. Someone was doing it deliberately and consistently, and they were betting that the volume would make individual discrepancies hard to isolate. "How much?" Mara said. "Conservative estimate, based on what we've pulled tonight. 3.2 million over 6 years. That number will go up when we have the full records." Mara looked at the screen over Garland's shoulder. The data was laid out in columns, procedure codes, billing dates, documented surgeon, reimbursement amounts, and even to a non-specialist eye, the pattern was legible once you knew to look for it. Codes that didn't match, complexity tiers that exceeded what the surgical notes supported, claims submitted on dates where the OR logs showed something different or nothing at all. Holt's name is on the billing, she said. Holt's name is on most of it, you said, but not all. There are 2 other physicians and at least 1 administrator with signing authority who would have had to approve the submissions. The administrator, Hargrove said. You nodded. Hospital board. We're still confirming the chain of authorization, but the submissions went through a single administrative approval node, and that node corresponds to 1 individual. Who? Mara said. Garland answered without looking up from the screen. Board Vice Chair, name of Dale Pritchard. He's been on the board for 9 years, also serves on the credentialing committee, which means he had oversight of physician performance reviews, including complaints. Mara thought about that for a moment. The credentialing committee. The body responsible for investigating and acting on concerns about physician conduct. If someone with signing authority over fraudulent billing also controlled the mechanism for investigating complaints about the physicians generating that billing, the circularity of it was almost elegant. Were there complaints about Holt, she said, filed formally? Garland looked up. 3, over the past 4 years, all reviewed by the credentialing committee, all closed without disciplinary action. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on the silence. We're going to need you to walk us through what you observed during your time in the ER, you said. Clinical irregularities, procedures that seemed inconsistent with patient presentation, cases where the treatment plan seemed disproportionate to the documented diagnosis. She said it in a tone that was businesslike but carried an undertone of something more. The awareness that what she was asking required Mara to think back over 4 months of work and identify moments of wrongness that she might have registered and dismissed. That's going to take time to do properly, Mara said. We have time tonight, you said. They had until 5 a.m. That was how long it took before the scope of what they were looking at required a different kind of process, one that needed more resources, more time, more formal structure than a conference of 6 people in a darkened administrative office at the back of a hospital's 3rd floor. You and Garland needed to get warrants moving. Hargrove needed to coordinate with her own chain of command about the intersection of the federal investigation and the military's interest in Pace's convoy. The picture was too large for one night, but in those 2 hours, Mara went through it. She sat across from you with a legal pad and a borrowed pen and thought backward through 4 months of shifts with the systematic care of someone who'd been trained to construct accurate after-action reports under pressure. She identified 11 cases where something had registered as wrong, where the treatment plan had seemed heavy relative to the presentation, where a procedure had been logged that she hadn't observed being performed, where a patient had been admitted at a complexity level that didn't match what she'd seen in the Bay. 3 of those cases she was certain about, certain enough to sign her name to and defend under cross-examination. 8 were softer, registered as strange in the moment, not followed up on, the kind of thing you noted and then let go because questioning and attending physicians' clinical judgment was not a behavior that contract nurses were structurally encouraged to develop. The 3 you're certain about, you said. Tell me the dates. She gave them. You cross-referenced against the billing records on her tablet. 2 of the 3 matched claims that were already flagged as suspicious. The 3rd pulled up a record that you looked at for a long moment and then turned the tablet so Garland could see it. That one's not in the current flag set, Garland said. No, you said, but look at the complexity code. She looked at Mara. You said the patient presented with a minor laceration, scalp wound, low blood loss, no neurological involvement. Correct. This is billed as a complex wound repair with imaging and neurological assessment. Yu's voice was flat. The imaging code is for a CT of the head. Was a CT ordered that night? Not by anyone I observed. You made a note. By 4:30 a.m., the legal pad had 4 pages of Mara's handwriting, and you had flagged 19 additional records for priority review. The number had grown as the cross-referencing deepened. Each case Mara described pulling up corresponding billing entries that revealed the pattern more clearly. The coding always precise, always pushing toward maximum reimbursement, Always just plausible enough that a cursory audit wouldn't catch it, but systematic enough that a dedicated review made it unmistakable. When it was over, Mara set down the pen and felt the accumulated weight of the last 18 hours settle into her shoulders in a specific physical way. She was tired in a deep muscle sense that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. "You're a good witness," Yu said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was a professional assessment delivered in a tone that meant she was accustomed to witnesses who weren't. "I was trained to document," Mara said. "It shows." Garland was already on his phone in the corner, his voice low and rapid. Hargrove had stepped out 40 minutes ago and hadn't come back, which meant she was running her own parallel process somewhere in the building. Solis was at the door. "You should sleep," Solis said. "A few hours. Things are going to accelerate this morning." "What time is it?" 4:51. Mara looked at the window. The rain had stopped at some point while she wasn't paying attention. The sky beyond the glass was still fully dark, but there was a quality to it, a faint shift at the edges, that said dawn was a couple of hours out. "Pace's extubation," she said. "Okafor has it. 7 a.m. if the overnight is stable." She went back to the on-call room, lay down with her shoes on, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. Chautit. She woke at 6:40 to her phone buzzing. It was Hargrove. "Come to the ICU. He's awake." Pace had been extubated at 6:55, slightly ahead of Okafor's estimate because his overnight numbers had been better than projected and the morning assessment had cleared him. By the time Mara arrived, he'd been off the ventilator for 20 minutes, breathing on his own, voice rough from the tube but coherent. He was sitting up at a modest incline, which was more than most post-operative splenic repair patients managed this quickly, and the expression on his face when Mara came through the bay door was the expression of a man who was in significant pain and choosing to set it aside for the moment. He looked at her for a long moment. "Calloway," he said. His voice was a wreck, hoarse and abraded, but the name was clear. She stopped at the foot of the bed. "General?" "Hargrove told me what happened in the trauma bay." He swallowed, which clearly cost him something. "How long were we down?" "Saturation was at 81 at the critical point. Tube was placed inside 30 seconds of that." He nodded slowly. The nod of someone logging a fact rather than reacting to it. "You look like you haven't slept." "I slept a few hours." Hargrove also told me about the billing records. His eyes, pale gray, sharp despite the medication and the exhaustion, moved to Hargrove, who was standing against the wall. "That's where you are with this?" "That's part of it," Hargrove said. "The convoy investigation is primary, but the two situations have," she paused, "points of contact that we're still mapping." "The contractor?" "Still locating." Pace looked back at Mara. "You gave them the name?" "Yes." "From the 2016 report?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The monitoring equipment registered his vital signs with the indifference of machines. Stable, adequate, the numbers of a man who was alive because of a specific sequence of events that had run the way it ran. He had the look of someone adding things up. "I remember you," he said. "Not personally, but I saw the report when it came through channels. Or rather, I saw that a report had been filed, and then learned that it had been administratively closed." He paused. "I was 2 rungs below the decision level at that point. I couldn't intervene directly, and I didn't have the standing to push back on the closure effectively." Mara didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say about it that was useful in this room right now. "I want to know," Pace said, "whether the copies you made in 2016 are intact." "They are." "And you'll make them available?" "With legal counsel present, yes." He almost smiled, a fraction of the expression, quickly controlled by the pain management it would have interrupted. "Smart," he said. "You were always smart. That's in the report, too." She looked at him. "With respect, General, you didn't know I was here." "No," he agreed. "I didn't, but I've been thinking about the 2016 report for 6 years, and the fact that you ended up in the ER that received my convoy on the day someone tried to kill me is either the most remarkable coincidence I've encountered in 30 years of service, or it's something I don't have a framework for yet." He held her gaze. "Which do you think it is?" I think it's a coincidence, Mara said. I've thought about it carefully, and I can't construct a mechanism by which it's anything else. Can't construct one yet, he said. Not skeptical, just precise. Can't construct one yet, she agreed. He leaned back. The slight movement pulled at something, and he absorbed the discomfort without remarking on it. Stay in Dalton, he said, at least until this moves into formal proceedings. Your testimony about the ER, the billing irregularities, that's material, and the 2016 documents are going to matter in ways we don't fully know yet. I intended to, Mara said. She left the ICU and went to find coffee, which was the most immediate and solvable problem available to her. The morning broke with the specific energy of a situation that has been building underground and is now, finally, beginning to surface. By 8 a.m., the hospital's administrative floor had a different population than usual. People who didn't work there, moving with purpose through corridors, usually populated only by billing staff and department coordinators. Mara saw Garland twice before 9 o'clock. She saw you once, moving fast with a stack of printed documents and an expression of complete focus. A pair of people she didn't recognize went into Pritchard's office at 8:45 and came out at 9:20, and Pritchard did not come out with them. She heard from Beatrice at 9:30. Beatrice had come in for her morning shift and had processed the overnight events with the careful incrementalism of someone who was gathering information before committing to a reaction. Holt hasn't come in, Beatrice said. They were in the break room. Beatrice was holding a coffee mug with both hands. He was supposed to be here at 7 for rounds. The chief resident is covering. Okay, Mara said. His office is locked. Someone from administration came by and asked if anyone had a key. Beatrice looked at her. Mara, what's happening? I can't tell you specifics, but the hospital's going to be okay. She said it because it was true, and because Beatrice had been here 11 years and deserved something real in response to the question. The staff is going to be okay. Beatrice, you know, when you came on contract, I thought you were quiet because you were one of those nurses who doesn't socialize. The type that's just passing through. I am passing through, Mara said. Or I was. You're not now. No, Mara said. I'm not now. It wasn't the whole truth. It was the part of the truth that was useful to say in a break room at 9:30 in the morning to a woman who'd brought her a protein bar the night before, and that was, under the circumstances, sufficient. The warrant for Holt's financial records came through at 10:14. You briefed Mara at 11 a.m. in the same conference room from the previous night, but with better light and more people. The picture the records described had expanded since 2:47 a.m., and not in a direction that simplified things. Holt's personal accounts showed a pattern of deposits, modest individually, regular in their timing, that correlated with the fraudulent billing submissions going back to 2019. Not in an obvious way, not a direct line, but routed through an LLC registered in Nevada that had no apparent business purpose other than to exist between the billing submissions and Holt's accounts. That LLC had a registered agent, whose name was not Holt, whose name was, instead, Dale Pritchard. The vice chair of the board, Mara said, who is currently in interview with federal agents and has been since 8:45 this morning, you confirmed. He requested an attorney at 8:47. The attorney arrived at 10:20. The interview is ongoing. And Holt? Not at his residence. His car is in the hospital parking structure. He came in this morning. We have him on the parking gate camera at 6:52. But he's not in his office, and nobody has confirmed his location in the building since 7:15. Yu's tone was the tone of someone reporting facts that are frustrating without being catastrophic. We're working on it. He knows, Mara said. Someone told him. That's our working assumption. The room held that for a moment. Holt in the building somewhere, aware that the situation had shifted under him overnight and trying to calculate what that meant and what his options were. That was a different problem than Holt simply absent. A person who has decided to run goes one direction. A person who's still inside trying to figure out their options is less predictable. Security is aware, Mara said. Hospital security and 2 federal agents doing a floor-by-floor. We're being low profile about it to avoid, Garland paused. Situations. She understood what he meant. A hospital in active operation, patients and visitors and staff moving through it constantly, was not an environment where a visible escalation served anyone's interests. The goal was to locate Holt quietly and confront him in a controlled context, not to create a building-wide alarm. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Stay available," Garland said. "Your testimony is going to be central to the billing fraud case, and we may need to move quickly on the formal statement once we—" His phone rang. He looked at it, picked up immediately. He listened for 14 seconds. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but his posture shifted, a slight forward lean that Mara recognized as the posture of someone receiving information that requires immediate action. "Where?" he said. Then, "Don't approach. I'm coming." He stood, looked at Mara, and then at you. "Holt's been located. 4th floor, supply corridor off the east stairwell. He's not alone." You was already moving. "Who's with him?" Mara said. "Hospital CFO," Garland said. "Name of Sandra Graft, and she has a phone out." He was at the door. "We need to move now because we don't know who she's calling, and we can't let this situation—" He stopped, because at that moment, Mara's own phone buzzed, and the number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, and she had the particular instinct, not rational, not reasoned, just the immediate below-language response of someone whose threat assessment had been running on a low continuous hum since 1:15 the previous night. That she needed to answer it. She held up one finger to Garland. Answered. The voice on the other end was not Holt, and it was not a number she knew, and what it said in the space of 11 seconds reorganized everything she thought she understood about the situation, because it was a woman's voice, careful and controlled and very clearly frightened, and what the voice said was, "This is Sandra Graft. I know what's in those billing records, and I know who set it up, and it wasn't Holt alone. I have documentation, physical documentation that isn't in the hospital system." A pause. "And I need you specifically because you're the only person in this building that I'm certain they haven't gotten to yet." The line stayed open. Mara looked at Garland, who was looking at her with the attention of someone reading a situation through someone else's face. "Where are you?" Mara said into the phone. 4th floor supply corridor, Graft said. "East stairwell. But you need to come alone, and you need to come now, because Holt is here, and he knows I have the documents, and he is not—" A break in her voice, brief and quickly controlled. "He is not okay right now." Mara held the phone and thought for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said to Garland, "She's not with Holt by choice." His expression went very still. "She has physical documents, and she wants to hand them over," Mara said. "But she'll run if she sees a federal agent come through that door. She called me specifically." She kept her voice level. "Let me go first. Give me 90 seconds before you follow." "That's not a procedure I can—" 90 seconds, Mara said. "She called me because she doesn't trust the institutional apparatus right now. And if your people go through that door before she's had a chance to hand over what she has, she either destroys it or you lose her cooperation entirely." She looked at him. "You know I'm right." Garland held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than 90 seconds felt like it should. 80 seconds, he said, "and I'm counting from right now." Mara was already moving. The east stairwell was the least trafficked route in the hospital, a utilitarian space used primarily for equipment transfer and the movement of supply carts. At 11:15 in the morning, it was quiet in the particular way of institutional spaces not built for comfort. Her footsteps on the concrete stairs were loud, and she didn't try to muffle them. She pushed through the 4th floor door, and the supply corridor opened in front of her, long, fluorescent lit, lined with locked storage units on both sides. 40 feet ahead, 2 figures. Graft was backed against the left wall, a woman in her early 50s, compact and visibly rigid, holding a manila envelope against her chest with both arms. She'd been crying at some point recently. Her face showed it, but she wasn't crying now. She was watching the other person in the corridor with the contained desperation of someone who has made a decision and is trying to hold it in place against pressure. Holt was 7 feet from her, not touching her, not moving toward her, but positioned in a way that blocked the direct route to the main corridor. He'd shed his white coat. He was in his street clothes, which meant he'd already begun moving toward leaving before he'd been interrupted, and his face showed the particular strain of a man whose situation has collapsed faster than his ability to respond to it. He looked worse than Mara had expected. Not threatening in a calculated way, but in the way of someone who had run out of good options and hadn't yet accepted that. He turned when Mara came through the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Holt said with a kind of exhausted contempt that had lost most of its force, "Of course it's you." "Dr. Holt," Mara said. She kept her voice even. She stopped 8 feet from him, equidistant between Holt and Graft, and assessed the corridor in the rapid peripheral way she'd been trained to and had never entirely stopped doing. No other exits except the stairwell door behind her and the main corridor door at the far end, which was 40 feet beyond Graft. "I need you to step back from Ms. Graft." "I'm not touching her." "You're blocking her exit. Step back." "This doesn't concern you." But he was already reassessing. She could see it. She was not what he'd expected. Or not in the way he'd expected it, and the dynamic of the corridor had shifted with her arrival in a way he hadn't calculated for. "The federal agents behind me will be through that door in about 60 seconds, Mara said. "Whatever you're trying to accomplish in the next 60 seconds, I want you to think carefully about whether it's going to help your situation." His jaw worked. "My situation," he said. "Yes. You destroyed my situation. You and whoever you dragged into this building." "I placed an airway on a dying man," she said, "and I documented what I saw over 4 months of shifts." "That's the totality of what I did." She kept her eyes on him, her weight balanced, her voice completely flat. "Whatever your situation is, you built it." Something in his face cracked. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, but in the small, specific way of a man who has been sustaining a position that required enormous energy and has just run out of the energy to sustain it. His shoulders dropped 2 centimeters. He looked at the floor. Graft moved. Fast, sideways, putting distance between herself and Holt, moving toward Mara's side of the corridor. She was still clutching the envelope. Behind Mara, the stairwell door opened. Garland came through with 2 other agents at exactly 78 seconds. And the corridor went from 3 people to 6, and the dynamic resolved the way these things do when the structure arrives. Not cleanly, not without noise, but with the inevitability of an ending that has been building long enough that the actual moment of it feels almost quiet by comparison. Holt didn't run. He stood with his shoulders down and his hands at his sides and let the agents reach him, and the only thing he said, the one sentence that came out of him in the fluorescent light of that supply corridor while Garland's people moved around him, was addressed not to the agents, not to Graft, but to Mara. He looked straight at her and said, "I didn't think you'd actually stay." She looked back at him. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Staying is the job." Graft was at her elbow. The envelope between them. Her hands were shaking now. Not a lot, but visibly. The shaking of someone whose adrenaline had been holding a position that the adrenaline was now abandoning. "The documents," Graff said. "I've had them for 2 years. I didn't know what to do with them. And then I was afraid to do anything. And then—" She stopped, swallowed. "There's a name in there, not Holt, not Pritchard." She pressed the envelope into Mara's hands. "Someone above both of them. Someone who has been directing this since the beginning." Mara looked at the envelope. "That name," Graft said, "is also in the DoD contractor database. I checked. 6 months ago I checked, and I didn't understand what it meant then. But after everything that happened yesterday, the helicopters, the military, General Pace," she looked at Mara with the wild clarity of someone who has just understood the full shape of something they've been holding a piece of for 2 years. "I think it connects. I think it all connects." Mara held the envelope and felt its weight, which was the weight of paper, and also something else entirely. Behind her, Garland said, "Ms. Calloway, I need that envelope." She turned. He was looking at her with the professional steadiness of someone who understood that what was in her hands had just become the most important object in the building. She held it out. He took it, and when he opened the flap and looked at the first page, something changed in his face. A small, precise change, the look of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they hoped was wrong. And he looked up at her and said quietly, so that only she could hear it, "We need to make a call, right now." The corridor held them all, agents, Holt's silence, grafts visible shaking, the fluorescent hum, the sealed storage units on either side. Mara stood in the middle of it and waited. Garland's call lasted 40 seconds. He spoke quietly with his back half turned, and when he ended the call, he looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has just handed a situation up to a level they can no longer manage personally. "The name in those documents," he said. "He's currently in a federal building in Washington, D.C. He has a security clearance at a level that requires specific authorization to touch." He paused, and he had a meeting with the Secretary of Defense scheduled for this morning. The corridor was very quiet. "Had," Mara said. "His assistant called 20 minutes ago to cancel it." Garland's voice was careful and precise. "He said the secretary was unavailable." Mara looked at him. "Garland," she said. "Which secretary?" He held her gaze for a moment that stretched in the way moments do when they carry weight they weren't built to carry. And then he told her. The name was Thomas Vrell, Deputy Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. 17 years in the department, the last 4 in a position that gave him oversight of every major defense procurement contract processed through the continental United States. His name appeared in 3 congressional testimony transcripts from the past decade, always in the context of efficiency, reform, responsible stewardship of public resources. He had a reputation for being difficult to read and easy to underestimate, which Mara recognized, hearing it described by Garland in the corridor, as the profile of someone who had cultivated both qualities deliberately. She didn't say anything immediately. She thought about the 2016 report, the specific irregularities she'd documented, the vendor relationships, the inflated unit costs, the contracts that moved through approval faster than the review timeline should have allowed. She'd identified a facilitating node, a mid-level contractor who'd had his access logs pulled yesterday. But a facilitating node implied a directing node above it, and she hadn't been able to see that high from where she'd been standing. Vrell had been in acquisition oversight since 2014, 2 years before she'd filed the report. "The Secretary of Defense," she said. "You said Vrell canceled the meeting." "His assistant called at 10:52, Garland said the secretary was unavailable and would reschedule. Or someone told Vrell the situation was moving faster than expected and he needed to create distance." Mara looked at the envelope in Garland's hands. "What's in there specifically? Beyond the name?" Garland had scanned the first several pages in the corridor, moving through them with the practiced speed of someone who knew what they were looking at. He'd gone quiet in the way that meant the quiet itself was information. Financial transfers, 12 of them, documented with account references, over a period of 18 months. The originating accounts correspond to 3 of the vendor LLCs in the billing fraud structure. The receiving account, he paused, is offshore. Cayman registered. The name on the beneficial ownership documentation is a trust, but the trust registered agent is a law firm in Virginia that represents several defense contractors. He looked up. One of whom is the contractor Pace was meeting about when his convoy was hit. The fluorescent light in the corridor hummed. Mara thought about a hospital billing fraud that generated $3.2 million over 6 years, routed through an LLC registered in Nevada. She thought about a defense contractor with a procurement contract worth, presumably, orders of magnitude more than that. She thought about the distance between those 2 things and what it would take to connect them. What kind of structure? What kind of people? What kind of long game? "The hospital fraud wasn't the point," she said. Garland looked at her. "It was a testing mechanism," she said, "or a funding tributary. Something small enough to run without drawing serious scrutiny, managed by people who were either inside the larger operation or useful to it in ways that kept them compliant." She thought about Holt, his contempt, his certainty, his willingness to fire a nurse who'd just saved a man's life because the alternative required him to acknowledge something he couldn't acknowledge. Holt didn't know the full scope. "That's our read," Garland said. "Pritchard?" "Probably the same. They were downstream of something they understood as profitable and were inclined not to examine too carefully." Graft, standing 2 feet to Mara's left, said quietly, "I found the documents because I noticed the LLC payment structure didn't match our vendor agreements. I was doing a routine reconciliation. I wasn't looking for anything." She said it in the way of someone who has rehearsed a statement many times in their head, waiting for the moment it would be needed. When I understood what I was looking at, I made copies and I kept them because I didn't know who was safe to give them to. I didn't know how far it went. You kept them for 2 years, Mara said. Not an accusation, just the fact of it. I have a daughter, Graf said. She's 11. She said it flatly, without asking for anything. Mara understood that completely. The next 4 hours moved in a register she recognized. The compressed, purposeful tempo of a situation that has transitioned from investigation to action, where the people who were previously gathering information are now deploying it. She was present for some of it, and not for other parts, which was appropriate. Her role in the convoy investigation was as a witness and a source. Her role in the billing fraud case was as a documented complainant with clinical testimony. Neither of those roles required her to be in every room. What she did instead was stay close enough to be available and far enough to stay out of the way. At 12:30, Holt was formally placed under arrest in a fourth-floor administrative office. Mara heard about it from Solis, who came to find her in the first-floor waiting area where she'd been sitting with bad coffee and the accumulated fatigue of 24 hours that had covered significantly more ground than most weeks. He cooperated, Solis said, gave a voluntary statement for about 40 minutes before his attorney arrived and shut it down. But what he gave them in those 40 minutes, she paused in the way of someone choosing words carefully, was enough to confirm the structure above him. Vrel, Mara said. He knew the name, he'd never met him. The insulation was deliberate, but he knew the name. What about Pritchard? Attorney present from the start, saying nothing. A beat. But the financial documentation from Graf's envelope is more than adequate without his cooperation. The transfers are documented, the account trail is being pulled as of this morning, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is coordinating with 2 other field offices that apparently have related open investigations that nobody had connected yet. Mara absorbed this. Related how? Other hospitals, Solis said. Same LLC structure, different cities. The Harwick operation wasn't unique. It was one of at least 4 that we know of so far. She looked at Mara. Harwick was just the one that had you in it. The waiting area was quiet except for the ambient hospital noise and the sound of a television in the corner cycling through a midday news program with the sound off. Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment. 4 hospitals. The same structure, replicated across facilities, generating money that fed upward through layers of insulation toward a procurement operation that was large enough to be worth protecting, with the kind of resources that reached people like Marcus Webb on mountain roads. She thought about Webb, the way he'd worked, the things he'd seen on that deployment that she'd also seen from a different angle and that they'd talked about, carefully, obliquely, in the way of people who understand that saying certain things out loud changes your relationship to them permanently. She thought about the fact that he was dead and she was sitting in the waiting room of a hospital that was, as of this morning, beginning to come apart at its administrative structure, and that these 2 facts were connected by a thread that had just become, for the first time in 7 years, visible enough to follow. What happens to Vrel? She said. Solis's expression moved through something complicated. That's above my level, she said. What I know is that Hargrove spoke to the Joint Chief's office at 11 this morning, and that the Secretary of Defense's meeting was canceled by Vrel's office, not by the Secretary. She paused. The Secretary is cooperating with the investigation. Mara looked at her. Vrel didn't tell him about the meeting, Solis said. He just canceled it on his behalf. At 2 p.m., Hargrove came to find her. They walked the east corridor of the hospital's ground floor together, which was the quietest route available. A long straight passage with offices on one side and supply storage on the other, almost empty at this hour. Hargrove walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be but had decided this conversation was the priority. The copies you made in 2016, Hargrove said. The originals of your report. Yes. We need them today, not tomorrow. The Attorney General's office is opening a formal investigation as of 3 o'clock, and the evidentiary chain needs to be established before the end of business. My attorney is on the phone with your legal officer right now, Mara said. She's been on it since this morning. Hargrove glanced at her. You retained someone quickly. I retained someone last night, after Reyes called me at 1 a.m., Mara said. When it became clear the situation was going to move into formal proceedings, I called an attorney I've had on retainer for 6 years. Since the discharge. Since the discharge. Hargrove was quiet for a few steps. I want to ask you something directly. All right. When you made those copies in 2016, when you knew the report was going to be buried, did you have a plan for what you'd do with them eventually? Mara considered this. It deserved a real answer, not a deflection. I had a contingency, she said. Not a plan. A contingency for the scenario where someone with the authority to act on the information came into possession of it through a channel I could trust. She paused. I didn't know what that scenario would look like or when it would happen. I just kept the documents current and kept them safe and kept moving. 7 years, Hargrove said. It's not that long in the context of how these things move. No, Hargrove said. It's not. She stopped walking, turned to face Mara with the directness that was her default register. I owe you something. Personally, separate from the institutional dimension of all of this. Mara waited. The 2016 report came across a desk that was 3 levels below mine. I didn't see it at the time, but 18 months later I saw a summary, a sanitized summary that characterized the report as unsubstantiated and the filer as, the word used was unreliable. She held Mara's gaze. I read that summary and I moved on to other things. I didn't pull the original. I didn't ask questions. The corridor hummed around them. I'm telling you that because you deserve to know that there were points at which someone with the standing to look more carefully didn't, Hargrove said. And I was one of those people. Mara held this. It wasn't an easy thing to hold. 7 years of the weight of being characterized as unreliable, of the professional displacement that had followed, of the specific loneliness of knowing something true that the structure around you had decided to treat as false. And here was someone saying plainly, I had a role in that, even a passive one. I appreciate that, Mara said. It's not enough. No, Mara agreed, but it's something. They stood in the corridor for a moment. Then Hargrove said, The Army is going to want to address your discharge formally. The characterization in your record. The process was flawed, and the documentation reflects that. It just reflects it in language that was designed to be deniable. And now that the underlying report is being validated by a federal investigation, that language is going to need to be corrected. Mara didn't respond immediately. She'd stopped letting herself think about what a corrected record would mean, somewhere around year 3 of the contracts, and the moving and the deliberate distance from her prior life. She'd packed it with the rest of the things that didn't serve her to carry. Let's get through this week first, she said. Hargrove almost smiled. Fair. The documents arrived at 3:40 p.m. Mara's attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been practicing federal employment and whistleblower law for 22 years, and had the calm of someone who had seen most of the ways institutional systems could betray individual people, had arranged for the secure transfer through a process that involved a courier, a chain of custody form, and a witness signature from both Garland and Osei herself. The documents were 4 years old in the copies and 7 years old in the originals, and they were in better condition than they had any right to be given the number of times Mara had moved and the number of different storage arrangements she'd used across those years. You received them and spent 90 minutes with them before she called the room to order. What the documents showed, cross-referenced against the billing records from Harwick, the financial transfers from Graff's envelope, and the access logs from the contractor who'd queried Pace's travel schedule, was a structure. Not the full structure. Yu was careful to say that, careful to describe what they could see clearly and what remained inferred, but enough of one to establish that the procurement irregularities Mara had documented in 2016 were the earliest visible point in a network that had subsequently expanded, diversified, and embedded itself more deeply into both the defense contracting apparatus and through the hospital fraud operations into civilian healthcare billing in at least 4 states. The specific mechanism connecting the hospital operations to the defense procurement was still being traced. But the shared LLC structures, The overlapping beneficial ownership and the name and graphs documents gave the investigation a thread it hadn't had yesterday. That thread led to Thomas Vrell. "He's lawyered up," Garland said. He was at the head of the conference room table, jacket still off, looking like a man who hadn't stopped moving since the previous night and was fueled on something other than sleep. As of 2 hours ago, his attorney released a statement characterizing the investigation as politically motivated, which is boilerplate, and Vrell himself hasn't been publicly visible since this morning. "Where is he?" Hargrove said. "His residence in McLean, Virginia. We have eyes on it." A pause. "He hasn't attempted to leave." "He's not going to run," Mara said. Everyone looked at her. "He's been building insulation for years. He's going to trust it. He's going to sit in his house and let his attorney work and believe that the distance he's constructed between himself and the operational details is enough to protect him." She looked at the table. "That's what people in his position do. They've never had to run before." Garland studied her. "You sound certain." "I'm familiar with the profile." She wasn't going to elaborate on that. "The question is whether the documentation is sufficient to move past the insulation." "It will be," Yu said. She said it with the specific confidence of someone who has spent a career following money and knows what it looks like when the trail is complete. The transfers and graphs documents correlate with dates and amounts in the contractor's own financial records, which we subpoenaed this morning. The beneficial ownership chain has 4 links, not 6, which is aggressive. Someone was confident enough in the insulation that they didn't build as many layers as they should have. She paused. That confidence was a mistake. The room sat with that for a moment. Pace's name came up at 4:15 when Solis came in with a message from the ICU. He was asking for a briefing. Hargrove went up. Mara wasn't invited for that meeting, which was appropriate. What Pace needed to hear from Hargrove was the operational and investigative picture, the convoy incident, the status of the contractor who'd accessed his travel schedule. The hospital's billing fraud and Mara's 7-year-old report were context, not primary briefing material. She sat in the conference room with Osei for an hour, going through the formal statement that would need to be filed, the whistleblower protection framework that Osei had been developing since the previous night, the likely shape of what came next. Osei was precise and thorough and didn't waste words. "The Army's correction of your record," Osei said at one point. Hargrove mentioned it this morning. "I want to make sure that process is handled correctly, not just administratively but formally, with documentation that the discharge characterization was erroneous and that the original report was substantiated." "Yes," Mara said. "That matters for more than your reputation," Osei said. "It matters for the legal framework of the whistleblower case. If the record shows the discharge was retaliatory, it strengthens the federal case against everyone who participated in suppressing the report." Mara hadn't thought about it in those terms. She'd thought about it in terms of her own history, her own record, the thing that had been written about her that wasn't true. Hearing it described as evidence in a case against the people who'd buried the report reoriented it in a way that felt, unexpectedly, more useful than the personal dimension. "Then let's document it properly," she said. At 5:30, Garland knocked and opened the conference room door. His expression was the expression of someone carrying something specific, and Mara had been reading that expression for the past 36 hours, well enough to know that specific was not the same as good. "2 things," he said. "First, Vrell's attorney has filed a motion in federal court challenging the subpoenas on the contractor's financial records. The motion is without merit, and it'll be denied. But it's going to take 48 hours, and in that window, the offshore account documentation we need to complete the transfer chain is inaccessible." "And the second thing?" Mara said. Garland looked at her. "Dr. Holt's voluntary statement this morning, the 40 minutes before his attorney arrived." He came into the room and closed the door. "He said something that we've been working to verify for the past 5 hours. We've now verified it." Osei put down her pen. "The original suppression of your 2016 report," Garland said. "The administrative decision to close it and characterize you as unreliable. Holt said he was told, in 2019 when he was first brought into the billing structure, that the decision to close that report had been coordinated. Not just received by a chain of command and quietly dropped. Actively coordinated. Someone had identified that the report was filed, identified what it contained, and made specific calls to ensure it went nowhere. Mara was very still. He said he was told this as a demonstration of reach, Garland said, as evidence that the people running the operation had the ability to protect their participants. He paused. He was told by Pritchard, who was told by the Virginia law firm, and the law firm's instruction came from Vrel, Mara said. Yes. The conference room was quiet. She'd known, abstractly, that the burial of her report hadn't been passive. A report didn't get closed, and a person didn't get characterized as unreliable through simple bureaucratic inertia. Someone had made decisions. She'd known that for 7 years. But knowing that a decision was made and knowing who made it and being able to prove that the same person who made it had subsequently built a larger operation that reached from defense procurement to hospital billing fraud to a targeted convoy attack on a 2-star general were 3 very different things. She was now in the 3rd category. His reach at that point, she said. 2016. He was already in acquisition oversight? He was, Garland said. He'd been there 2 years. So when I filed the report, I was already inside his operational environment without knowing it. Yes. She thought about that for a moment, the specific quality of it, the fact that the things she'd done carefully, through proper channels, with documentation she'd constructed with the intention of creating a record that would survive scrutiny, had arrived at a desk where someone read it as a threat and made calls. And here she was in Dalton, Oregon, 7 years later, in a conference room with a federal agent and her attorney, with the documentation to prove all of it. "What do you need from me?" she said. "We need a formal declaration, on the record for the court filing, that your 2016 report was accurate, that the information in the copies matches the original submission, and that you have no knowledge of the report being modified before suppression." Garland looked at her steadily. "And we need it before the 48-hour window on the subpoena challenge closes. Because when that challenge fails and we get the offshore account documentation, we're moving on Vrel. And we want everything else in place before we do." Osei was already writing. Mara picked up a pen. She was halfway through the first section of the declaration when the room's phone rang. The conference room landline, which was routed through the hospital's system. Garland picked up, listened. His face did the thing it did when information arrived that required rapid reprocessing. He ended the call and looked at Mara. "Vrel," he said. "He's not at his residence in McLean." She looked up from the declaration. "He left 40 minutes ago," Garland said. "The surveillance team lost him in traffic near Tyson's Corner. His attorney's office just received a message saying he's arranged a voluntary meeting with the Senate Armed Services Committee. Not through the Justice Department, not through the FBI. Garland's jaw was tight. He's going directly to Senate oversight, and he's going to get ahead of this by framing himself as a cooperating witness. Mara set down the pen. If Vrel reached the Senate committee and established himself as a voluntary cooperating witness before the DOJ's case was formally filed, he gained leverage, the kind of leverage that came from being the person who named others rather than the person named. He could reshape the narrative around him into one where he was adjacent to wrongdoing rather than directing it. The financial documentation was strong, but in the space of a Senate committee meeting with the right framing, strong documentation became contested documentation, and contested documentation moved through timelines that didn't favor people who'd waited 7 years for the story to arrive where it was supposed to arrive. She thought about Marcus Webb on a mountain road. She thought about the 48 hours it would take to clear the subpoena challenge. She thought about what a man who'd been running an operation this size for a decade looked like when he understood the walls were closing and decided that moving first was the only option left. "He's not cooperating," she said. "He's maneuvering." "I know," Garland said. "Then you need to file before he gets in front of the committee," she said. "Whatever you have right now. The transfers, Graff's documents, the billing records, Holt's statement, my declaration." She looked at him. "File it tonight. Don't wait for the offshore documentation." Garland looked at you. You looked at Mara. "If we file without the offshore chain complete," you said carefully, "the case is solid but not airtight. His attorneys will find the gap and they will use it." "If you don't file tonight," Mara said, There won't be a gap in his case because he'll have spent the next 18 hours constructing a different version of events in front of a Senate committee with cameras. She picked up the pen again. Get me someone who can take the verbal portions of this declaration while I write the rest, and let's finish it in the next hour. Garland looked at her for a moment with something she hadn't seen from him before, not the professional assessment that had been his dominant register since they'd met, but something more direct and less managed. All right, he said, and picked up the phone. The declaration took 53 minutes to complete. Mara wrote the documentary sections by hand on the forms Osei had prepared, speaking the contextual portions aloud to a court reporter who had been reached by phone and was dictating remotely, a process that was legally adequate and logistically imperfect and got the job done. Her handwriting was steady. It was always steady under pressure. That was one of the things the Army had given her that she'd kept without ambivalence. Garland had the filing package out of the building by 7:15 p.m. The DOJ's emergency filing hit the federal docket at 8:43 Eastern Time, which was 5:43 in Dalton, and which beat Thomas Vrell's arrival at the Senate Armed Services Committee building by 11 minutes. His attorney was photographed on the steps. Vrell was not. The attorney gave a brief statement about his client's willingness to cooperate with congressional oversight, and the statement was already being filmed by 2 news cameras that someone had tipped, which told Mara, watching the footage on Garland's phone in the conference room, that Vrell's team had planned the optics of this carefully. What they had not planned for was the filing. It took 40 minutes for the news to reach the cameras on those Senate steps. Mara watched the attorney's face change in real time on a clip that someone shared. The moment a staffer appeared at his elbow with a phone, the way the attorney's posture shifted, the very brief and very controlled expression of a man who had just learned that the ground he was standing on had changed while he was standing on it. Vrell did not enter the Senate building that evening. His car left the parking area at 9:22 Eastern. His attorney released a second statement at 10:05 that used the word inappropriate 4 times in reference to the DOJ's filing and made no reference to the voluntary cooperation framing from the first statement. Garland read both statements without expression. His attorneys are going to file a challenge by morning, he said. It won't work, but they'll file it. Let them, Yu said. She was packing her materials with the focused efficiency of someone who has finished a phase and is already thinking about the next one. The financial transfer documentation from the offshore accounts comes in 48 hours regardless of the challenge, and what we filed tonight is sufficient to freeze his assets and his clearances as of midnight. His clearances, Mara said, suspended pending investigation, effective the moment the filing was accepted. You looked at her. He can't access the procurement systems. He can't contact the contractors. He can't do anything to the evidentiary chain from the outside. A pause. That was the point of filing tonight. Mara understood that. She'd understood it when she'd pushed for it 3 hours ago. But hearing it stated plainly, the specific mechanism of it, the way the filing functioned as a wall between Vrell and the tools he'd used for a decade, had a quality she hadn't fully anticipated. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than satisfaction. The recognition that the structure, imperfect and slow and frequently weaponized in the wrong direction, was capable of functioning correctly when the information it needed finally reached it intact. She'd spent 7 years carrying that information intact. She slept for 6 hours that night, genuinely this time, in the same on-call room with the industrial soap smell and the acoustic tile ceiling. When she woke at 6 a.m., the hospital outside the door sounded different. The same mechanical rhythms, the same PA, the same footsteps, but with an undertone of something that she eventually identified as the particular quality of an institution that knows something has changed and is still processing what that means. Beatrice was at the nurse's station when Mara came through the ER at 6:30. She looked up and held Mara's gaze for a moment. Holt's replacement starts Monday, Beatrice said. Interim chief. They announced it an hour ago. How's the department taking it? Beatrice thought about this with the honesty of someone who'd been at Harwick long enough to see several versions of it. Confused, she said. Some people are angry at the disruption. Some people are relieved in a way they don't want to say out loud. She looked at her coffee cup. Some people are asking why nobody noticed sooner, and I don't have a good answer for that one. The structure wasn't built to make it easy to notice, Mara said. That's not an excuse. It's just the mechanism. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, Mara said. It's just true. Beatrice made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. Then she reached under the counter and produced a full coffee, sealed, from the good machine on the second floor. I went and got it before my shift started, she said. I figured you'd be in early. Mara took it. Thank you. Don't make it weird, Beatrice said, and went back to her charts. Pace's formal discharge from the ICU happened at 10 a.m. He was being transferred to a military medical facility outside Portland for the remainder of his recovery. A decision driven partly by security and partly by the logistics of his ongoing participation in the convoy investigation, which would require access to secure communication systems that a civilian hospital couldn't provide. Mara was not part of the discharge process. She heard about it the way she heard about most things now, through Solis, who had become an efficient and reliable conduit for information that Mara needed without always having a direct channel to obtain. What she didn't expect was Pace himself, in a wheelchair pushed by an orderly, appearing in the ER corridor at 10:45 with Hargrove walking alongside him. The transfer team was 3 people behind them with the particular patience of people accustomed to waiting for generals. Mara was coming out of a supply room when they rounded the corner. Pace looked at her. He looked better than he had at 6:55 the previous morning. Color returning, the specific vacancy of heavy sedation gone from his eyes, replaced by the alert and slightly impatient expression of a man who found the wheelchair a more significant indignity than the splenic repair. "Walk with me to the entrance," he said. She fell into step beside the chair. Hargrove dropped back 2 paces with a discretion that felt deliberate. "The filing," Pace said. "Hargrove briefed me this morning." "Yes." "You pushed for it last night, against the standard evidentiary caution." "Yes." He was quiet for a few steps. The corridor moved around them, staff parting for the chair, a few double takes at the general's insignia. "Why?" "Because Vrel was going to move faster than the process," she said. "And the process was the only thing that mattered, not the timeline, not the completeness. The process reaching him before he could define himself in relation to it." "You were gambling with the case," Pace said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a clinical observation. I was making a risk assessment with incomplete information under time pressure," she said, "which is something I've done before." He made a sound, dry, brief, the compressed equivalent of a longer response. "Yes," he said, "you have." They reached the main lobby. The entrance doors were visible at the end of the passage. The Oregon morning outside bright after the days of rain, pale and clear and cold in the specific way of the Pacific Northwest after a weather system has moved through. He stopped the chair with a gesture to the orderly. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you say anything." She waited. "What happened to you in 2016 was wrong," he said. "The report was accurate. The response to it was not a failure of process. It was a deliberate subversion of process by people who understood that the process, functioning correctly, would have stopped them earlier. And the way that subversion was documented in your record, the characterization, that's going to be corrected. Fully and formally, not administratively minimized." He held her gaze. "I'm going to personally ensure that happens, because I have the standing to, and because it should have been done years ago." Mara kept her voice even. "Thank you. I also want to say this." He shifted in the chair, an uncomfortable movement, controlled. "The thing you did in that trauma bay, the airway. I've been told by 3 separate clinicians in the past 24 hours that the approach was technically exceptional, that most people with your training wouldn't have attempted it under those conditions, and that the ones who might have would have needed more time and more attempts." He paused. "You gave me that chance. I don't take that lightly." She looked at him. He was not a man given to sentiment. That was clear in everything about his manner. And the way he said it had the quality of something he'd decided was necessary to say, rather than something he found easy. "You had a good surgeon," she said. "Ferreira." "I did," he agreed. "But I needed to get to her." He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and said everything the words had already said. "Take care of yourself, Calloway." "You too, sir," he signaled the orderly. The chair moved toward the doors, and the morning light came in when they opened, and Mara stood in the lobby and watched the transfer team receive him on the other side with the organized competence of people doing a job they'd done many times. Hargrove appeared at her shoulder. "The formal correction to your record will be processed through the Army's Human Resources Command," she said. "Patricia Osei has the contact and the reference number. It's not fast. Nothing through HRC is fast, but it's in motion." "I know the timeline," Mara said. "I know you do." A pause. "There's something else. An offer, not a requirement." Mara looked at her. "The investigation is going to produce proceedings," Hargrove said. "Federal criminal proceedings, congressional oversight hearings, probably a separate military review of the procurement structure. That's a long process. 18 months minimum before it reaches anything resembling resolution." She folded her hands in front of her, the posture of someone presenting information carefully. "The FBI's Medical Fraud Unit is putting together a task force specifically for the hospital billing network. 4 facilities, potentially more. They need someone who understands both the clinical environment and the investigative framework. Someone who can review medical records, identify billing irregularities, and testify to clinical accuracy under cross-examination." Mara understood where this was going. "That's not a nursing contract," she said. "No, it's a consulting role, civilian, coordinated through the DOJ. The pay is better than a travel nursing contract. The stability is," Hargrove paused, "real. An actual address. An actual assignment that lasts longer than 4 months." Mara looked at the entrance doors. The lobby was quiet. Outside, the transfer vehicles were pulling away. She'd been moving for 7 years. Not running. She'd been careful, always, to maintain the distinction between moving and running, because running was reactive and moving was something she'd chosen. But she could see now in the clear way that things sometimes become visible when the pressure that was obscuring them finally lifts, that the line between those two things had blurred somewhere around year 4. That she'd been keeping a distance from her own life under the reasoning that the distance was protective when actually it had become habitual. "Yes," she said. Hargrove nodded once. "There's a debrief in Portland next Thursday," she said. "I'll send the details through Solis." She looked at Mara with the directness that had been her register throughout, the look of someone who has seen a great deal and decided that most of it is better addressed plainly. "You're good at this, Calloway, not just the clinical work. All of it. The documentation, the risk assessment, the staying." A pause. "You were always good at it. It's a shame it took this long for the right people to see it." She walked away without waiting for a response, which was also in character. The news broke publicly 3 days later. The DOJ's filing had been under a partial seal pending the asset freeze, but once the freeze was confirmed and Vrel's attorneys had filed and lost their initial challenge, the seal was lifted and the full scope of the charges became public record. It was larger than what Mara had known in the conference room at Harwick. The offshore accounts, once the challenge failed and the documents arrived, showed transfers spanning 9 years and 4 jurisdictions. The procurement contracts implicated were 17 in number, collectively worth close to $2 billion over the period of the scheme. The hospital billing network was a tributary, as she'd assessed, one of several parallel structures that had generated operating funds, and perhaps more importantly, leverage over people who could be useful. Thomas Vrel was indicted on 11 counts. The list was read into the federal record on a Thursday morning and was public by noon. Mara was in a temporary apartment in Portland by then, a short-term rental arranged through the DOJ's contractor housing program. 2 rooms and a window that faced a courtyard with a single tree that had just started to come into leaf. She read the indictment on her laptop at the small kitchen table with a coffee that she'd made herself, in a coffee maker she'd bought at a pharmacy 2 blocks away because she'd been tired of bad institutional coffee. 11 counts. The language was precise and dense in the way of federal charging documents, but what it described was clear. A man in a position of public trust who had spent nearly a decade using that position to systematically redirect public money, protect the network doing the redirecting, and eliminate or neutralize anyone who came close enough to threaten it. Marcus Webb's name appeared in the investigation's supporting documentation, not as a victim, that determination was ongoing, but as a related case under review. The mountain road outside Reno had been re-examined by a federal team, and the preliminary findings had been designated as inconclusive pending further analysis, which in Mara's experience of how these things moved meant that the findings were not supporting the original accident determination. She thought about him, the way he'd worked in conditions that would break most people. The things he'd taught her that had stayed in her hands across years and deployments and eventually into an ER in Dalton, Oregon on a Tuesday morning. She let herself think about that for a few minutes without trying to compress it into something useful or actionable, which was harder than it should have been and maybe necessary. Holt's medical license was suspended pending the criminal proceedings, which were expected to take most of a year to reach trial. Pritchard had reversed his silence after the full scope of the federal case became clear. A pragmatic decision by his attorney that meant he was now cooperating and that his cooperation was making the case against the people above him more complete. The credentialing committee complaints that had been quietly buried were being reviewed by the Oregon Medical Board. 3 of the 4 prior complainants had been contacted. The hospital itself, Harwick General, was under administrative oversight while the board reconstituted itself and the billing systems were audited in full. The staff was there. The work continued. Patients came in through the ER every shift, and the nurses and physicians who remained took care of them because that was the job, and the job didn't stop for institutional upheaval. Mara got a text from Beatrice. On the Thursday, the indictment was announced. It said, "Portland treating you okay?" She typed back, "Getting there." "How's the department?" The response came 4 minutes later. Loud, "Interim chief is actually decent. Dolores Martinez sent flowers to the nurses' station. You remember her, the troponin patient? She came back to say thank you. Asked about you specifically." Mara read that twice. "Tell her I'm glad she's okay," she typed. "Already did," Beatrice sent back. And then after a moment, "You did good, Mara." She set the phone down on the kitchen table, looked at the courtyard through the window. The tree had small pale leaves just beginning to open, the tentative kind that come in early spring when the weather hasn't fully committed to the season yet. She thought about what Beatrice had said. Not the way it was meant as a compliment, she understood the intention, but in the literal sense, what she'd done. The sequence of it. The airway at 12:04, the documentation filed immediately after, the documents she'd carried for 7 years. The declaration written at a table in a hospital conference room in the middle of the night. The push to file before the window closed. None of it had been clean. Not a single piece of it had arrived in a form that didn't require something from her. Judgment, stamina, the willingness to act on incomplete information and stand behind the action afterward. She'd made calls that could have been wrong. The push to file before the evidentiary chain was complete could have cost the case its margins. The decision to go first into that supply corridor could have gone differently. These things were true, and they weren't erased by the outcome. What she understood, sitting in a short-term apartment in Portland with bad early spring light coming through the window, was that this was what it actually looked like. Not the version where someone with the right credentials acts at the right moment and the system recognizes it immediately and corrects itself. That version didn't exist. What existed was the longer, messier, more exhausting version where a person carries a true thing through years of institutional resistance, keeps it intact through the attrition of being told repeatedly that they are the problem and not the thing they documented, and waits for the moment when the structure finally has no option but to receive what they've been carrying. 7 years was a long time to carry something. She'd done it anyway. Not because she was exceptional. She knew better than to tell herself that story. Because the story of exceptional people doing exceptional things was the version that let everyone else off the hook for what they failed to notice or chose not to examine. She'd done it because the alternative was accepting that the true thing she'd documented was less important than the comfort of setting it down, and she had never been able to make that calculation come out in favor of setting it down. That was the whole of it, not heroism, not strength in the cinematic sense, just the inability to decide that the truth was less important than the cost of carrying it. On the 3rd Friday after the indictment, Osei called with news that the Army's formal correction to Mara's record had been processed. The characterization had been removed. The language about reliability had been struck. The discharge had been reclassified, with a formal notation that the circumstances surrounding it were under federal review and that the original report submitted by the service member had been substantiated. "It's done," Osei said. "It's not the apology you deserved, and it's not as fast as it should have been, but it's on record, permanently." Mara sat with the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You gave me something real to work with," Osei said. "That's the job." After the call, she stood at the window for a while. The tree in the courtyard had more leaves now than it had on Thursday. It was still tentative, but it was committed. You could see the difference between early leaves and the ones that had decided to stay. The debrief in Portland had gone well. The task force work started in 10 days. She had a meeting next week with the lead federal attorney on the hospital fraud cases, who wanted to walk through the clinical testimony framework for the proceedings. She had things to do and a place from which to do them, and a history that was no longer stored only in documents she kept in safe storage across a series of temporary addresses. She thought about the first day at Harwick, the way the shift had started at 5:52, 8 minutes early, because that was the habit. The way Holt had looked at her, through her really, in the manner of someone for whom she didn't register as a complete person. The way that look had been so familiar she'd barely noticed it, because she'd learned to move through spaces where she wasn't seen and do the work anyway, and keep the record clean. She thought about the rain hitting her scrubs in the parking apron. She thought about 3 Blackhawks dropping out of the overcast. There was something she'd learned, across all of it, that she couldn't have articulated at the beginning and could only articulate now imperfectly. That the people who are dismissed earliest are sometimes the ones carrying the most important information, and that institutions are very good at generating the conditions under which dismissed people decide their information isn't worth the cost of holding on to it. The whole system depended, in a quiet, structural way, on the dismissed person eventually letting go. She hadn't let go. Not because she was certain it would matter. She'd had years of reasonable uncertainty about whether it would matter. But because the thing she knew was true regardless of whether anyone in a position to act on it ever chose to. And she had decided in the early aftermath of the discharge that she was not going to let someone else's decision to look away change what she understood to be real. That was the part nobody talked about. Not the dramatic moment in the trauma bay, not the filing that beat Vrel to the Senate steps by 11 minutes. The 7 years in between, the moving, the contracts, the careful maintenance of documents in a storage arrangement that changed address every time she did. The daily decision, not made dramatically but made nonetheless, to keep going in the direction of the truth, even when the truth had no visible destination. That decision was available to anyone. It cost something real. It cost comfort and stability and the easier life of a person who has put down what they were carrying and found that the weight was gone. It cost relationships and continuity and the feeling of being known in a place over time. She didn't pretend otherwise, but it was available. And the people who needed to remember that most were not the ones who'd already decided to carry the weight. They were the ones standing at the beginning of it, looking at something true that the structure around them was already preparing to call unreliable, trying to decide whether what they knew was worth what it was going to cost them to keep knowing it. It was. That was the whole message. It was worth it, not because the outcome was guaranteed, and not because the system would eventually reward the effort, and not because being right made the years easy, but because the alternative was a version of yourself that had decided the truth had a price tag and you couldn't afford it, and that version of yourself had to live with what it let go of. Mara Calloway had never been able to live with that. She went to make another coffee. The cheap pharmacy machine took 90 seconds and produced something adequate, which was fine. She had work to do and a clear morning ahead of her, and the tree in the courtyard had leaves that were going to be fully open by next week. She drank the coffee standing at the window, watching the light move through the leaves, and then she sat down at the table and got to work.